Okay, welcome back from the break. Hopefully you got a chance to stand up, stretch your legs, go take a drink, whatever it was that you felt you needed to do at this time. So welcome back. Let's take a look at the concept check question so we can get on with the next section. So the appearance of oxygen in the atmosphere likely triggered a massive extinction event amongst prokaryotes at the time. Why? Well, remember, prior to this, in the absence of oxygen, life would almost certainly have been totally anaerobic. And there would have been no mechanism in place for the prokaryotes of the time to neutralize the chemical reactivity of oxygen. So with the appearance of oxygen and its extreme chemical reactivity, any prokaryote at the time that did not have a mechanism in place to neutralize the oxygen would have been killed by the presence of oxygen. And so almost certainly the vast majority of prokaryotes died off at this point simply because they lacked the ability to neutralize the oxygen. Again, you have to remember that in natural selection and evolution, the appearance of a mutation that provides an adaptation to a change in the environment must be pre-existing to that change. You cannot develop that mutation at the time the change occurs. It's too late at that point. Think about it this way in modern terms. If a bacterium is to survive an antibiotic, it must already be resistant to the antibiotic before it confronts the antibiotic. Otherwise, it's going to be killed by it. So any mutation that's going to provide an adaptation to an environmental change must be pre-existing. And given that the vast majority of prokaryotes at this time would lack a mutation that would allow them to neutralize the oxygen, they would be killed by it. So that's why there must have been a massive extinction event at this time. Fortunately, some life forms were able to cope. It is considered that mitochondria preceded plastids or chloroplasts in the evolution of eukaryotic cells. What's the evidence for this? Well, the evidence is the fact that mitochondria are universal to all eukaryotes, irrespective of whether they currently carry functional mitochondria or not. And the reason why we say that is because in the genome of all eukaryotic cells, we find the presence of mitochondrial sequences that were transferred from the endosymbiotic bacteria via horizontal gene transfer. Those are present in all eukaryotic cells without exception. So those unicellular protists that we'll encounter in chapter 28 that appear to lack functional mitochondria contain degenerate organelles that are derived from mitochondria. They no longer carry out the function of mitochondria by virtue of the fact that these organisms are parasites and they get their energy resources from the organisms that they parasitize. So they don't actually need functional mitochondria. And remember the cost-benefit analysis equation. There is no value in generating functional mitochondria if you're not going to get any benefit out of them, or you don't really need them because you are a parasite and you're getting your organism from your energy from the organism that you're parasitizing. And so there's no reason to invest resources and energy in making functional mitochondria, so they don't. But that doesn't remove the mitochondrial gene sequences that are found in the genome. They're still there, even though they're not necessary for the production of functional mitochondria anymore. And in fact, we can look at the genomes of many eukaryotic cells. Our own are a great example of this, where we find what are called pseudogenes. These are genes that once were functional, but a mutation has occurred to shut them down. But we still recognize that they were once functional genes, and the DNA has not gone away just because the gene has been turned off. It's retained because of the nature of DNA replication. So we see the vestige of the gene, we've referred to it as a pseudogene, indicating that at one point it did perhaps have function in the past. And we see that amongst the unicellular protists that no longer have functional mitochondria. They still have the gene sequences. So that's the evidence. And of course, the other observation that parallels this is the fact that only a small number of eukaryotic cells, algae and plants, actually contain plastids, the chloroplasts and the other organelles that are related to chloroplasts, the leucoplasts and the chromoplasts. So if the two events had occurred at the same time, we would expect all cells to contain both organelles. If the chloroplasts had been endosymbiosed first, we would expect those to be the universal organelles and mitochondria to have a less than universal distribution. But mitochondria have the universal distribution, chloroplasts do not, so that's also evidence that mitochondria were captured first, chloroplasts second. So let's move on into the next section. So one of the things that we do need to recognize when we look at the fossil record, or what we see in the fossil record, is that no species or no group of organisms is immune from extinction. All species and all groups of organisms eventually become extinct or go extinct. In fact, if we look at the average time that a species is present in the fossil record, the vast majority of species have an existence in the fossil record of roughly 3 to 5 million years. Some a little bit shorter, some a little bit longer. And even the organisms that have been present in the fossil record for an inordinate amount of time as a group, so we could consider the dinosaurs that were present in the fossil record in the classic form of dinosaurs that we recognize for about 170 million years, they still went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous. Although not all dinosaurs went extinct, remember, the birds are still here and the birds are dinosaurs. So I guess you could say that the dinosaurs are still around if you but they just don't dominate the landscape like they did in the past, I guess. But again, it was the loss of the dinosaurs or the extinction of the vast majority of dinosaurs 65 million years ago that allowed for the rise of mammals. And you need to also bear in mind that mammals were around for as long as there were dinosaurs. Mammals trace their origin back to the origin of reptiles back in the Permian, where you have those hairy reptiles that we were talking about in a previous section, as the common ancestor to both modern day reptiles and modern day mammals. And so mammals as a distinct group were present through the vast majority of time that the dinosaurs were present. They just didn't have a chance to expand because the dinosaurs were the dominant form of terrestrial tetrapod. It was only with the loss of the dinosaurs, the extinction of the dinosaurs, that mammals had their chance. But that's the point. When you have an extinction, you not only lose individual species or groups of species, but you also provide an opportunity for any organisms that survive the extinction event to then thrive and expand and adapt to into the vacated niches that are now open. So there are a number of mechanisms that we need to be aware of that provide these opportunities. So one of the first is simply an understanding that the Earth's crust is not stable. If you've ever been through an earthquake, and I've been through several, I used to live in California and experienced my fair share of earthquakes there, but also I was living in a region of Australia on the west coast in Perth when there was a major earthquake. which came out of the blue because we don't normally expect earthquakes in Australia. It's considered to be a very stable continent, but we've had several major earthquakes over the last 40 or 50 years that have come as a surprise to most people because there is no fault lines that we were aware of. Australia sits in the middle of a tectonic plate and is, as I said, considered to be relatively geologically stable compared to other continents. But no continent is immune from earthquakes. And so once we understand that the continental land masses are not stable, that they're actually moving, then we have to bear in mind that the movement of those plates and the movement of the continental land masses on them will have an effect on the history of life. The idea of continental drift, the fact that the continents that we see today scattered over the surface of the Earth are actually moving, have not been in these locations for long periods of time, was first proposed back in 1912 by a German meteorologist named Alfred Wegener. Now, Wegener had time to look at atlases when he was stuck in the middle of Greenland doing meteorological observations, because he was actually a meteorologist. And this was part of the problem. When he first proposed this at a scientific conference in 1912 and subsequently in a book in 1915, geologists of the time basically said, what do you know about this? You're a meteorologist, not a geologist. And so they didn't take his ideas seriously. But what he had observed was, particularly, is that South America and Africa slot together pretty nicely. And if you look at some of the other continents and you move things around, you start to realize that the continents as we see them today form a very large jigsaw puzzle. The pieces have just been pulled apart. And so Wegener proposed that the continents actually move across the surface of the Earth. Now, the actual idea that there could be movement amongst the continents was not actually new when Wegener proposed it. People had made observations that suggested that this was the case, going all the way back to the 1600s, in fact. But no one had formally proposed that this was the case until Wegener made his proposal in, as I said, in 1912 and then subsequently in 1915 in book form. It would take a long time for people to actually start to realize that Wegener was correct, because no one recognized that, in fact, there was not a single surface to the Earth, but it was actually broken up into tectonic plates. And you can see here the plates mapped out as we know them today. The evidence would come in several different forms. One is called geophysics, and in this case, they were looking at magnetic particles in rocks, and we've already talked a little bit about this. But in various locations around the world, particularly where plates are pulling apart, you find these parallel stripes of magnetic particles in rock that are orientated according to the Earth's magnetic field. And as I've pointed out before, that flips backwards and forwards, north to south, south to north, periodically on a time scale measured in hundreds of thousands of years. We actually think there's a flip of the Earth's magnetic field likely to take place somewhere in the not too distant future. It may already be underway. There is a suspicion that it might actually be starting to occur now. And when you look at the layers of rock that are spaced out at equal distances from one of these locations where the plates are pulling apart, you find that the orientation of the magnetic crystals in each of these matching layers is the same. And the only way that you can explain these regular patterns moving away from a single spot is if those rocks were liquid at the point where they were together, and they have been separated over time as they solidified. So that was one piece of evidence. And that was really only came in the 1960s. The final piece of evidence that really laid the whole argument of continental drift and plate tectonics to rest was the mapping of the ocean floor and the release of a comprehensive map of the ocean floor in 1977. Now, this had been mapped a whole lot earlier by the US Navy, but it was considered to be a national secret. And so the information was not made public for a long period of time, but eventually the information was released, and it laid out the floor of the ocean around the world. And it became very obvious that there were large regions of spreading zones, most notably the mid-Atlantic ridge, which runs all the way down the center of the Atlantic Ocean. So let me highlight this. So this is the mid-Atlantic ridge. It runs all the way down the Atlantic Ocean, but it doesn't stop because an extension of it comes around here and up into the middle of the Indian Ocean. And in fact, this is the longest mountain range on the planet, because there are undersea mounts associated with the mid-Atlantic ridge. And Iceland, which is located up the top here, sits on top of the mid-Atlantic ridge. It straddles the mid-Atlantic ridge, and there is a region in the middle of Iceland, which again I've had the good fortune to visit, which consists of a number of very steep, broken valleys, I guess you would call it, in the lava, because a lot of Iceland is covered by lava, where you have the spreading zone. This is the reason why Iceland is so volcanic, because it is are actually moving away from each other, and that's where the lava is coming from. And you can go and stand in the valley, as I did, and have 1 foot, and you can find the locations, and have 1 foot that is on the North Atlantic plate, and 1 foot that, North American plate, and 1 foot is on the Eurasian plate. And you can say that you are slowly being spread apart. The spreading rate, however, is very slow. It takes place at around 2.5 centimeters a year, which is about the rate at which your fingernails grow. So it's not an obvious spreading unless you measure it over time, but it is nonetheless spreading. And so in some places you have spreading, in some places you have plates rubbing against each other as they slide past each other. In other places you have one plate going underneath another one, which is called a subduction zone. And these are all characterized by the presence of earthquakes and volcanoes. So when you look at the distribution of volcanoes and earthquakes around the world, you start to recognize that they are sitting on these regions where you have the tectonic plates either moving away from each other, rubbing against each other, or subducting underneath each other. And in fact, the deepest point in the ocean, the Challenger Deep in the Marianas Trench, is formed by the fact that the Philippine plate is sliding underneath the Pacific plate, and that is dragging both plates down and creating this deep point in the ocean that is over 35,000 feet deep. And other deep points in the ocean are the product of exactly the same idea, where one plate is sliding underneath the other on the bottom of the ocean, dragging both of them down and creating this deep point in the ocean. This region in Africa, the East African Rift, is another spreading zone. The eastern part of Africa is actually moving away from the rest of Africa, and it is slowly splitting. It's very geologically active. Mount Kilimanjaro is here. The volcanoes of Central Africa are located along the western edge of this rift. And it is important also because this is thought to be where genus Homo evolved, including Homo sapiens. And it is likely that the geological activity and the ongoing changes was part of the driving force that gave rise to the large number of hominin and hominid, so ape-like and human-like species that we refer to as Australopithecines and members of genus Homo that originated in Africa. It may have, this geological activity may have actually played a significant part in our own evolution. Then we have that region called the Pacific Ring of Fire that begins down here at the tip of South America. The Andes are part of it because you've got the Nazca Plate subducting underneath the South American plate. And the Andes are a long range of largely volcanoes that sit about 100 miles in east of the subduction zone, which is the reason why they're there, because that's where the hot lava from the rubbing of the two plates comes together. Also explains all the earthquakes that occur, particularly off the coast of Chile. Then up through Central America and the volcanoes of Central America and Mexico. Up the east coast here, we've got, if you ever wondered why California is so geologically unstable, it's because you've got two plates rubbing against each other. When you get up to the Pacific Northwest, you've got the Juan de Fuca plate subducting underneath the North American plate. And so that gives rise to the volcanoes of the Cascade Range, including Mount St. Helens and Mount Rainier. We go on up past the earthquake zone of Alaska, and then the volcanic zone of Alaska, volcanoes and earthquakes of Alaska. Again, on the Pacific Ring of Fire, then down through the volcanoes of the Kamchatka Peninsula, that extension of Siberia on the eastern edge of Russia, down through the volcanoes and earthquakes of Japan, remember Mount Fuji, and then on through the earthquakes and volcanoes of the southern islands of Japan, so Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and then down through to the earthquakes and volcanoes of Indonesia, and down through the earthquakes and volcanoes of Papua New Guinea. And then if you extend on far enough down, we come to the volcanoes and earthquakes of New Zealand. So all this can be explained according to the movements of the volcanic plates. And even down here, you've got a volcano in the Antarctic Ocean adjacent to the spreading zone of the Antarctic plate. And this is, if I remember right, this is Heard Island. It's a large volcano in the middle of the Antarctic Ocean. Of course, then you've got other sources of volcanoes. So here in the middle of the Pacific plate, you've got the volcanoes of Hawaii. This, in fact, represents a hotspot in the middle of the plate where lava has broken through the plate from underneath and given rise to the volcanoes. And this has been occurring for a long period of time. In fact, Hawaii itself and the Pacific plate are migrating in this direction. And if you look up in the ocean underneath, you find a lot of undersea seamounts that are the product of volcanic activity where it never quite made it to the surface of the ocean, all being generated by this hotspot. And an extension from here is Midway Island. And then eventually you can track these all the way across almost to Siberia. So this plate has been moving for an extended period of time. But it also explains why Hawaii consists of a series of islands that are spaced out in this direction. And that has had some influence on the flora and fauna that has evolved on Hawaii, because anything that is there has come from somewhere else and colonized the islands as they became available, as they emerged from the ocean over time, over the course of about the last 3.5 million years or so. And then you have the Galapagos Islands that sit off the coast on the Nazca Plate. And again, they are the product of volcanism, and they've been around for about 3 million years, I think, is the time frame that we think, and they sit right here off the coast of South America. So when we start thinking in terms of continental drift and plate tectonics, we think in terms of the origin of land masses. But of course, we also have to think in terms of how that has affected the evolution of life over the course of time. And we do start to see some influence. So one of the things that I've already mentioned, but I should remind you again, is that at a point in the past, around 300 million years ago or thereabouts, maybe a little bit further back in time, I think it is, but certainly by around 275, 250 million years ago, all the continental land masses as we recognize them today had come together to form this large single supercontinent called Pangaea. And this is what would, we think, be in part the driving force behind the evolution of amniotes, and particularly the two big groups of amniotes, the reptiles, diversifying from the diapsids, and the mammals diversifying from the synapsids, the two big groups that would split from the common hairy reptile ancestor and would come to dominate land masses. And the reason why is because a single large landmass like Pangaea was substantially drier and warmer than the individual continental land masses that had preceded it. And this change in climate came about because when the land masses came together, that not only were large parts of the supercontinent at a distance from the ocean and therefore substantially drier, but the existence of this large continental landmass would also change the movement of water in the oceans, the ocean currents. Excuse me. And the ocean currents are major drivers of the climate because they affect the air that sits above the ocean in terms of its humidity, the flow of the air, and therefore the carriage of ocean moisture onto the land masses, and the availability of water in the form of rain to those land masses. And so the amphibians that were dominating the landscape in the late Devonian and early Permian would find life on dry land very much of a challenge as it started to dry out. And those amphibians or ancestors to what would become the amniotes that had a mechanism for preventing drying out and would eventually evolve, the amniotic shelled egg, would have a distinct advantage over traditional amphibians in this sort of a condition. Then if we want to further understand the biogeography of some fossilized organisms, we can only explain it in terms of tectonic movement, the plate tectonics and continental drift. And that was some of the evidence that was presented as early support for Wegener's idea, although it was not considered to be conclusive, but it certainly could only be explained in terms of continental drift. And if we want to look at current biogeography, then if we think in terms of the origin of mammals in terms of the major mammal types that dominate the landscape now. So we have the marsupials that obviously dominate Australia, and then we have eutherian or placental mammals that dominate everywhere else. Well, as we look at the origin of marsupials, marsupials originate in South America. And you can see that it, during the time of Gondwana, was together with Africa, Madagascar, what would become India, Antarctica, and Australia. And that would allow marsupials to migrate from South America through Antarctica and into Australia. Now, you might wonder, how could they migrate through Antarctica? Well, you have to remember that Antarctica at this time was not the cold, icy, forbidding continent that we know today. It was not located at the South Pole region yet, and it was not completely isolated from other land masses. And so at this point, it was quite temperate, and that would allow the migration through. And so marsupials dominated the southern continent, Gondwana land, throughout this time period. But as the continent started to break up, South America would then migrate away from Africa, and Africa would migrate northwards into Laurasia. Eutherian mammals would originate in Laurasia, would then migrate down into Africa. So there are Eutherian mammals that we recognize as ancestral to Laurasia. And Laurasia, by the way, is North America, Europe, and Asia. And eventually Africa would join as it moved northwards. India would separate out and would migrate across what is now the Indian Ocean and would collide with the Asian landmass and start buckling the floor of the ocean as it did so, and would push up the Himalayas, and they're still being formed as India continues to migrate northwards. Eventually, South America would break away from Antarctica and Australia, and eventually Australia would break away from Antarctica. Antarctica would migrate down to where it's located now and be surrounded by cold water currents that would eventually turn it into the cold, forbidding continent that's pretty much devoid of all life forms except those that can survive in a very cold, very dry environment. So there is some life there. And Australia would migrate northwards, and it continues to migrate northwards. It's moving up towards the equator even as we speak. But the marsupials on Australia would then become isolated, along with remnants of an earlier mammal form called the monotremes. Those are the egg-laying mammals, of which there are 4 species remaining, and that would be the platypus and 3 species of echidna. And those are native to Australia and New Guinea, the big island north of Australia. And so the marsupials would come to dominate the Australian landmass simply because from about 60, maybe 50 million years ago, it was completely isolated, and the marsupials were the only terrestrial tetrapods in the form of mammals that were extant on the landmass, and so they were able to expand to dominate Australia, so that when ultimately some terrestrial mammals were able to, eutherian mammals were able to make their way down through the Indonesian archipelago towards Australia, they found no available niches for them to occupy, because marsupials fulfilled all the roles of eutherian mammals elsewhere. It was only when humans eventually made it to Australia and brought the ancestors of the dingoes, the wild dogs of Australia, to the Australian landmass that eutherian mammals eventually gained a foothold on Australia. Marsupials also dominated South America for an extended period of time. There are still marsupials in South America, but eventually South America would migrate northwards and link up with North America. And when the Isthmus of Panama eventually formed up around 12 to 20 million years ago, eutherian mammals that were evolving in North America migrated down into South America and largely displaced most of the marsupials. But one marsupial did migrate northwards out of South America and successfully colonized North America. And you've seen them. These are the opossums. So the American opossum is in fact a marsupial that made the reverse migration out of South America into North America. Now, what may surprise you is that North America is also the home of camels and horses. But the horses that are present in North America now arrived with the Spanish in the 1500s. So they are not descended from the horses that evolved in North America. Those would eventually, the horses as they evolved in North America would eventually migrate into Laurasia. And the oldest living species of horse today is the Przewalski's horses that are native to the plains of Siberia. Horses are the descendants of the early horses that evolved in North America would die out, as would the ancestors of camels. However, some early camel or cameloids must have migrated down into South America as well, because you have cameloids in South America. These are the alpacas and the llamas and the guanacos. So what am I saying here? What I'm saying is that the biogeographic distribution of species today and the biogeographic distribution of species in the fossil record is a product of plate tectonics and the fact that the land masses move around, driven by the underlying currents in the liquid rock that underlies the tectonic plates. And a lot of what we understand about the evolution of life and the distribution of life forms on the planet as we see them today and as we see them in the fossil record is explainable by understanding the movements of the continental land masses. It all makes sense once we recognize that the surface of the Earth, even on a large scale, like the continents and the tectonic plates that the continents sit on, is not static, that it is dynamic and things are constantly moving, that we begin to understand the reasons why the trajectory of life may have gone in the direction that it's gone in, and that the distributions of organisms that we see extant today and the distribution of organisms that we see in the fossil record are what they are. This is one of our basic understandings. The other major event that has had a huge influence on the trajectory of the evolution of life is mass extinctions. Now, we know that there is always an underlying extinction of species over time. That's, again, because the existence of any species is not guaranteed or permanent. As I said, in the fossil record, the existence of a species usually extends for around 3 to 5 million years. Very few species stay present in the fossil record for much longer than 3.5 to 4 million years, in fact. So the vast majority of species that have ever existed on the planet, we make the statement around somewhere between 95 to 99% of all species that have ever existed on the planet are extinct. And we know about some of them through the fossil record, but we don't know about all of them because most of them never got fossilized, or if they did, we've not discovered their fossils. So that tells us that extinction is a reality. It is part of the evolution of life. Not only do species evolve, but they do go extinct if they fail to adapt. And the reality is that sooner or later, species encounter geological changes that almost certainly they are unable to adapt to, and they become extinct. However, if small populations within that species do possess suitable adaptations, they may go on to yield a new species. So not only is extinction a reality, but so is speciation. So we have to remember that those two processes are a natural consequence of natural selection. But at certain periods of time, there have been geological events that have been so disruptive that they have led to the loss of significant number of species, and these we refer to as mass extinctions. So here you can see a timeline that shows extinction events that we can easily document from the fossil record. These are extinctions that are significant enough to be identifiable in the fossil record by the disappearance of significant numbers of organisms. And then there are 5 events that are so significant that we recognize them as the 5 mass extinctions in the history of life. So we've got one here that we can identify. So that's the end Ordovician. Then we've got an end Devonian. We've got the end Permian, and you can see how significant that is. That's the single biggest mass extinction on record. This resulted in the loss of 96% of species. Then we have an end Triassic, and this is almost certainly the one that gave the dinosaurs their experience, because their chance, because dinosaurs were present or appear in the fossil record in the mid to late Triassic, but they're really small. Most of them are about the size of a chicken or maybe a turkey. But with the end Triassic, and we're not entirely sure what caused the end Triassic extinction, the ancestors of all dinosaurs into the Jurassic and Cretaceous survived that, whereas other reptilian forms did not. And so this gave the dinosaurs an opportunity to adapt and radiate, and they came to dominate the Jurassic and the Cretaceous. And then we have the end Cretaceous, which is the loss of the dinosaurs. This was about a 70% extinction. So a significant number of species went extinct here. It wasn't just the non-avian dinosaurs. Remember, the birds are dinosaurs, but they didn't go extinct here. But you also have the pterosaurs, the mosasaurs, the ichthyosaurs, and the plesiosaurs. A lot of marine species go extinct here. The ammonites went extinct in this. The ancestors to, or early relatives of mollusks went extinct during this time period of this extinction. There were a lot of aquatic species went extinct, but also a significant number of terrestrial species went extinct as well. The vast majority of these mass extinctions are correlated with warming events. So here you can see the 5 mass extinctions in red, and all but one is associated with a warming event. And so this is the end Permian, which was a massive global warming event. And I think I've already mentioned that this was the product of a massive volcanic eruption in what is now Siberia, where the Earth's crust split open over hundreds of kilometers and gave rise to a huge volcanic eruption that's referred to as a flood basalt eruption. You see these, you see smaller examples of these even today, particularly in Iceland, where the plate separation causes cracks in the Earth's crust, and the lava comes flooding out. But this was a flood basalt eruption that went on for about 1 million years and covered a large swath of Siberia and Asia in thousands of feet of lava, arranged in layers. that look very step-like. And this is why they are called the Siberian traps, trap being a Norwegian or derived from a Norwegian word for step, reflecting the step-like layer of the lava. And so we believe fairly strongly that this is the product, or the end Permian extinction was the product of this huge volcanic eruption, because not only was lava ejected during this time, but significant amounts of volcanic gases as well: carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, sulfur trioxides, hydrogen sulfide, all gases that are known to contribute to global warming, particularly carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, to some degree the sulfur dioxide. And water. Water is also a contributor in the upper atmosphere to trapping heat energy, surprisingly enough. And so this gave rise to an estimated increase in global temperature of around 10 degrees Celsius. And we can tell that it was a warming event, and we can tell that these other ones were warming events. So here and here, we can tell that these were warming events by looking at isotope ratios. So this is particularly true of organic material in the form of methane, and anything that contains oxygen, because oxygen comes in two isotopes, oxygen-16 and oxygen-18, and carbon comes in three isotopes, carbons 12, 13, and 14. Now, 13 and 12 are stable, 14 is radioactive. So we don't think in terms of carbon-14 ratio here. We're thinking in terms of carbon-12 and carbon-13, and we're thinking in terms of oxygen-16 versus 18. Whenever there is a major warming event, we see an enrichment in molecules that contain the heavier isotopes, so oxygen-18 and carbon-13, compared to the lighter isotope, carbon-12 and oxygen-16 respectively, because the lighter isotopes are more volatile when things heat up, and the heavier isotopes are less volatile. And so when you see an enrichment in the heavier isotopes and the depletion of the lighter isotopes, we know that a warming event has occurred. And so when we look at these four mass extinctions that are associated with an increase in temperature, we know that a global warming event occurred because of the isotope, the change in the isotope ratios. In the case of the end Cretaceous, and we'll come back to this diagram, which has been ascribed to a meteorite strike in what is now the Gulf of Mexico off the coast of Yucatan, and overlaps with the Gulf of the Yucatan Peninsula. There's a massive crater there. It's about 100 kilometers in diameter, and it shows all the characteristics of a meteorite strike. And we now know that it is, in fact, a meteorite strike, probably a meteorite in the order of a 6-mile diameter large chunk of rock that collided with the Earth. That is obviously a life-altering situation. But there were some other things going on at the same time. So you recall that I said that India migrated from adjacent to Africa up into the bottom of the Asian landmass. Well, around the time that the dinosaurs went extinct, so the end Cretaceous extinction around 65, 66 million years ago, there was also another large flood basalt eruption in what is now India that gave rise to what is referred to as the Deccan traps. And one of the reasons why in 2012, when I was going around the world, I visited India was to go and take a look at this region, knowing that it was associated with this extinction event. And so it's quite possible that this flood basalt eruption that took place in what is now India, because India crossed a hotspot in the middle of the Indian Ocean. It's still there. The island called Reunion Island actually sits on top of that hotspot right now. But at the time that India was passing across this, there was this massive Deccan Trap erupt, what gave rise to the Deccan Traps, this massive flood basalt eruption around this time period as well. It was nowhere near as large as the Siberian traps of the Siberian eruption, but it was nonetheless one that went on for probably 200,000 to 300,000 years is the estimate, and it has given rise to a substantial layer of lava. It's measured in 3,000 to 4,000 foot depth on average, sitting on top of the plains of India. And it actually gives rise to the inland mountain region where the British used to go for relief from the heat in the plains of India. And a lot of the famous regions where the British used to go are actually sitting on top of the Deccan Traps. And when you drive, I went out from Mumbai inland. When you drive out along the main road that goes out from Mumbai to Pune, it climbs up through the face of the Deccan Traps. And when you drive out there, what you see is flat ground until you come to this huge layer of lava that rears up out of the plains and rises, as I said, 3,000 to 4,000 feet, almost directly vertical. And when you get up there and you go to various places and you look out along the edge, you can clearly see the layers, the stratigraphic layers of lava, and you can see how the lava flowed out, forming these layers. And so you have to take this into account as well, because if we're going to posit that the Siberian eruption, as large as it was, gave rise to the massive Permian extinction, and that's our best hypothesis, then we also have to take into account that the Deccan eruption, while it may not have been enough to explain the total end Cretaceous mass extinction, it likely contributed, and the meteorite strike was sort of the final insult, if you wish, that pushed life into this major extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous. We don't know for sure, and in fact we'll never know with absolute certainty what the cause of any of these extinctions are, because the record does not say definitively that any of these hypotheses explain the cause of these mass extinctions. However, the correlation between, for instance, global warming and 4 of the mass extinctions tells us that mass extinction is possible, and extinction rates increase significantly with an increase in the Earth's temperature. And even if we go back and look at the diagram again, where we don't have major extinction events like the 5 mass extinctions, or if we go to this one, we still note that a lot of extinction events are associated with warming. But again, there are extinction events associated with cooling, but the truly big mass extinctions all have a direct connection to increased Earth in the Earth's temperature, which is the reason why we are so concerned with the potential for a human-driven global warming mass extinction, because there is no question but the Earth's temperature is increasing. And while you may not necessarily associate that with human activity, there is no question but that human activity is increasing the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And as we know that carbon dioxide does trap heat energy, it is very easy to draw lines from one point to the other and create a direct connection between our activity as consumers of fossil fuel, which increases the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the ongoing measurable increase in overall global temperatures. And so the fossil record gives us a very good indication of what happens when global warming happens. And that's the reason why biologists and ecologists are really concerned about the consequences of global warming today and the potential for what may happen in the future. But irrespective of what may cause a mass extinction, one of the things that we do know is a product of every mass extinction is an increased opportunity for the survivors to diversify and adapt into the vacated ecological niches that have been produced as a consequence of the extinctions. So every time we look at the fossil record and we look at the period following a mass extinction, we see not only a loss of species reflected in the fossil record in terms of the overall number of species, but as we look in the fossil record and move away from the period of the mass extinction, we see a change not only in the distribution of species, but also we see an increase in the overall number of species. So here at the end of following the Permian, we see an increase in the number of predatory species almost immediately following the extinction. Why? Because there are plenty of carcasses for them to utilize as a food source. So predators have a field day because of the amount of food that's left behind for them. So those species that manage to survive the extinction event and are specifically predators have an opportunity to diversify and increase in numbers. But you notice that the numbers also come back down again over time because as life diversifies and the number of dead organisms get removed from the environment, the level of support for predators obviously wanes and the number of predators must decrease. And then at the end Cretaceous, we see exactly the same thing again, a rise in the increase of predatory species. Now, I can't give you a good reason for why it continues to go up here, but I believe a little bit later on we see an actual decrease again and settles down. So I can't give you a really good reason as to why it maintains high in this period. I'm not an expert on this area, so I can't tell you why the number of predatory species remains high throughout this time period, except perhaps that there is an opportunity for them, obviously, to diversify. And perhaps it is a product of the fact that there was such a massive die-off at this point, particularly in the oceans, that gave rise to an opportunity for predators across the board to increase in numbers. But what we do know is these extinction events do provide opportunities for the survivors. And this opportunity is generally referred to as adaptive radiation. And adaptive radiation can take place in two ways. So you can have an overall global adaptive radiation. So this is what happened at the end of the Cretaceous. So you see the loss of all the ocean, or you see a substantial loss of species in the ocean, which provides opportunities. You see a loss of terrestrial tetrapods, not to the same degree, but nonetheless a substantial loss of terrestrial tetrapods, and that is reflected in opportunities for mammals to expand. And so mammals expand on land, but also expand into the oceans again in the form of the cetaceans, whales and the dolphins, in the form of the manatees and their relatives, what are known as the Sirenians. That's include some species that are still extant. So you have a number of species of manatees. You have the dugongs in Australia, but you also have a couple of species that we only know from history, most notably the Bering sea cow, which was essentially a large manatee that was hunted to extinction in the 1800s by whalers and sealers that went into the Bering Strait. We only know this from records now. But those are all mammals. And of course, you've got the all the pinnipeds, the seals, the sea lions. These are all mammals that are descended from terrestrial tetrapods that have returned to an aquatic existence post the end Cretaceous extinction. And so with the loss of the plesiosaurs, the ichthyosaurs, and the mosasaurs as the reptilian aquatic animals and dominant animals, you now have an opportunity for mammals to take over. And so we see mammals not only taking over land, but we see mammals taking over in the oceans as well. But those opportunities would not happen without a global mass extinction. And so with all of the global mass extinctions, the 5 big mass extinctions, there was almost certainly opportunities for the survivors to take over and dominate habitats, ecosystems, niches as a consequence of the loss of the existing species. So here you can see a diagram that shows the correlation between the extinction of the dinosaurs, which is taking place right in here, and the diversification of mammals as a consequence of the loss of the dinosaurs. So there is an increase, a gradual, slow increase in the number of mammalian species, but they can't radiate rapidly as a consequence of the presence of the dinosaurs and the other reptiles that are dominating different habitats. So again, the aquatic reptiles, and I won't go through the list, but once they become extinct, you start to see a massive increase in the number of mammals, both eutherian and marsupial, as a consequence of the loss of the dinosaurs and other reptiles that dominated the landscape. But adaptive radiations can also be localized. So wherever you have new land masses appearing, like the Hawaiian Islands, which are about 2,500 miles from everywhere, or the Galapagos off the coast of South America, or any other landmass that appears as a new landmass, provides an opportunity for organisms that can take advantage of this completely new landmass to adapt to it and to radiate, to take advantage of all the potential habitats and niches that they may find there. So here's an example of an adaptive radiation in Hawaii. This is a series of plants that is known as the silver sword group. And you can see that there's a wide range of forms that are found in different habitats throughout the Hawaiian Island chain. But all of these are derived apparently from a small plant that grows on the west coast of North America called the tarweed. So there's about 2,500 miles between the west coast of North America and the Hawaiian Islands. But somehow either seeds or pieces of plant made their way to the Hawaiian Islands at some point after the islands started to emerge. And here you can see the time frame for each of the islands emerging, and started to adapt into the environments that were there because there was no competition at the time that they arrived. And this is very characteristic of any island chain. Hawaii has been thoroughly studied. And this is the reason why when Darwin looked at the species in the Galapagos, he found this diversity of organisms in the form of the finches and the giant tortoises and in plants, but could also see a similarity to species that were extant in South America that he'd seen previously. And this would start him thinking, once he got back to England, about what had happened in terms of the colonization of the Galapagos Islands from South America, and how the species that came from South America might have potentially given rise to all the different types of organisms that he observed in the Galapagos. These are all examples of local radiations. So when a founding group that has moved to a new location, new landmass, is able to utilize the existing environment in some fashion and can then start to accumulate adaptations to that landmass, and as landmass changes and as local landmasses in the form, like the Galapagos, of new islands, or Hawaii in the form of new islands, they can radiate to the new land masses and take advantage of those and take on different forms as a consequence of this. Again, it's all about being able to utilize the niches that have become available as a consequence of either loss of species or appearance of new habitats in the form of new land masses. And just so that you know, the next island in the Hawaiian chain is actually forming off the southeast coast of the Big Island. There is a new island forming underwater as a product of volcanic activity. It's probably not going to emerge for another couple of million years yet. It's still fairly deep in the water, but it is still rising. Will it emerge from the water? Well, we don't know. Remember that there are other underwater seamounts located out here in the island chain, with Midway Island being one that made it to the surface, and we can go further on to others. But we know that this hotspot has given rise to many new masses of land, many of which failed to make it to the surface. But it's possible that another island will form sometime in the next couple of million years, or maybe not. It may just turn out to be another underwater seamount, but certainly something is building there. And off the southern coast of Iceland, there is a new island that has formed over the last 30 years or so. And this is one that is being kept isolated. You can't land there without special permission from the government, so that scientists can follow the colonization of this new landmass to see what the process is, the process of colonization is like, as plants and in some cases now insects have started to colonize this fresh land as a product of volcanic activity, to see how the progressive colonization of this island can take place, because this gives us an opportunity to look at what has happened in the past in Hawaii and the Galapagos and elsewhere where life has colonized new ground. So time for another break. Here's our concept check question that, again, I'll answer when we come back from the break. So based on evidence from previous mass extinctions, what evolutionary and ecological consequences could result if a human-caused mass extinction, sixth mass extinction, occurs? Okay, so I will see you on the other side of the break with the answer to this question.